Steve Matthews is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Hong Kong. And, well, he started off as a typologist, and he defended his PhD thesis, A Cognitive Approach to the Typology of Verbal Aspect, in 1990 in University of Southern California. And already then he was working with Cantonese and Mandarin. And since then, he's become the leading expert on Cantonese and comparative Sinitic. Not only worked on Cantonese, also worked on Qiujiao or Chaozhou dialect of Minnan. And among other things, he's together with Virginia Yip, he's published the Cantonese A Comprehensive Grammar, which, stupidly enough, I would have wanted to show, but I managed to take it home with me over the weekend, and I forgot to bring it with me. But it's the authoritative grammar of Cantonese, and he's worked on written other textbooks on Cantonese as well. And also established the Hong Kong Bilingual Child Language Corpus, which led to a prize-winning book, The Bilingual Child, in 2007, together with Virginia Yip, and I've got it in the bookshelf there. I won't run over and fetch it now. So Steve has worked on Sinitic, he's worked on language typology, he's worked on language acquisition, he's worked on the social linguistics of bilingualism in Hong Kong, he's worked on Pidgin languages and Creole languages, such as Baba Malay, China Coast Pidgin, and that's just a smattering of what I managed to find on a publication list that was on Google Scholar of more than 250 publications. So today we're very happy to have Steve with us to give a talk on some unresolved problems in Cantonese grammar. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much, Arthur, and I wish I could be there. Let me see if I can share the screen. Yes, so some of us wish we were in Lund, so here is I believe a picture of autumn in Lund. Maybe you can recognize the spot. So when Arthur invited me, I'm afraid I don't have anything very original to report, but I do have some do have a number of what I consider unresolved areas and unresolved questions, and I want to show you what some of those today. We have a limited time, so I chose two of these unresolved areas to share, the topic of the bare classifier noun phrase and the topic of the semi-complementizer or semi-complementizer wa. So the bare classifier noun phrase is something like 港澳太贵, and as I often point out, it's on the surface a very simple thing to say, but as we'll see, it's not such a simple thing to analyze, or there isn't a clear agreement on how to analyze it. Similarly, with the question of, is this a complementizer? Where is the complementizer? Is wa a complementizer? Is wa a complementizer, or both? Right? And these are the kind of sentences that you will find in Cantonese literature. This is where many of my examples come from these days. This is the novel La Mian Hoi Kong. A man cannot afford to be poor. Right? So there's some kind of examples that you will find there. What is a bare classifier noun phrase? It's called bare with the implication that there's something missing, or that there is sort of surprisingly nothing on it, right? Like a bare mountainside. It's bare because, unlike the case with Mandarin or written Chinese, there is nothing preceding the classifier. So classifier noun, we have a noun phrase consisting of classifier and noun, nothing in front of it, right? So 港澳 in the previous example, 港澳太贵. 港澳 in the previous example merely consists of classifier and noun. As Arthur pointed out, the bare classifier can be used in what in practice behaves like a definite article. So in a sentence like this one, it looks as if it does mean the house, as I'll argue. And so this is actually one of many unresolved issues that Arthur points to in his generous review of our Cantonese grammar. It behaves like a definite article, but how come? What does that mean? Does it mean that classifiers are articles or classifiers are determiners? Well, that has become a matter of debate, as we'll see. And I want to review roughly three kinds of answer to this problem. And the first one is whenever I teach this topic, somebody wants to argue that this noun phrase is bare because somebody has left out the demonstrative, right? So that the house is really that house, right? And the advantage or the temptation of that is that it then fits with the general picture of written Chinese grammar or Mandarin grammar or even universal Chinese grammar, as Wei Chao called it. A second possibility, so the number one, if you like, is that the Chinese approach or the Mandarin approach to the problem is to say that this results from leaving out the demonstrative. Of the other end of the spectrum, the English approach to this problem would be to say that well, this is just like an article, or perhaps the European approach, a more sophisticated approach, rather than saying that it's like an article, it is similar in function to a D, that is the determiner in the formal grammar model of Cheng and Supersmore and other colleagues. A third possibility is that the classifier, these are simply classifiers, but somehow the classifiers acquire referential properties such as definiteness, specificity, adhere to classifiers. And this has been best described in the Miao languages, notably by Walter Bisang, and raises the possibility that Cantonese has these puzzling properties as a result of substrate influence from the Hmong-Mien or Miao language family. So the first solution is to treat the bare classifier as an abbreviation of something else, and in the grammar of spoken Chinese, Zhou Ren basically says this, that the classifier, the bare classifier, well, he didn't use this term because we didn't have it yet, but reading between the lines, what he's basically saying is that this phrase that we're focusing on is an abbreviation either of meaning a house or meaning that house, right? And there are many other versions of this this idea. It's a very popular solution, if you like. Does it work? Half. My view, the first half of it works. So it is basically possible to derive the indefinite reading of Gangok from Gangok by omission of a numeral 1. And again, this is something that Arthur Holmer proposed in his review of what was missing in our grammar. So in my experience, that solution works. The second solution doesn't work so well. And so the idea is that classifier noun is at some level is demonstrative classifier noun. What would demonstrative be? Well, I've said go, meaning that, but we have two demonstratives in Cantonese, this and that. So how do you know which it is? That's one puzzle about this solution. The attraction of the solution is that it facilitates having a general noun phrase structure for Chinese, which many scholars have tried to develop, right? And it fits the idea of what Zhou called a universal Chinese grammar and an overall grammar, which fits the whole of Chinese with modifications where needed for the grammar of particular dialects or varieties. Zhou's idea of universal grammar has been debated. I wrote an article trying to understand what he meant and why he was saying it. So since it always seems to me a strange idea, you eventually find out. Well, you can see why he wanted to say that, although in my experience it doesn't work very well, and I'll try to show that in a minute. So we try to show it right now. That solution immediately raises the question: is the Baer classifier noun phrase equivalent in any way to a demonstrative classifier noun phrase? And the answer seems to be yes and no. So in the most typical case, the Baer classifier noun phrase, the definite classifier noun phrase is anaphoric. It's referring back to a previously mentioned referent, as in 佢有隻貓，嗰隻貓就好聰明啦。So we could either say 隻貓就好聰明, the cat is very smart, or we can say 嗰隻貓就好聰明. There's going to be a lot of cats today. So this is the cat belonging to my colleague Dai Zongpoi, and it always seems to me this is a very intelligent cat. It's a Siamese, not an ordinary cat. It's a Siamese cat, right? There's a reputation for being particularly smart. So the cat is smart. We know he has a cat, and the cat is smart. And in this case, we could say the cat or that cat. But in another case, you can say that she has a lot of animals at home, and then we can continue by saying so among the animals that she has, the cat is particularly smart. Okay, and in this case, both in Cantonese and English, we can say the cat is smart, but we cannot say that cat is really smart or because fails to refer. Right, so in this case is not equivalent. The Baer classifier construction, the cat is not equivalent to a demonstrative construction, that cat. Right. What is this case? This case has been called bridging anaphora. So it's a kind of anaphora, but where, strictly speaking, the referent, the cat, has not been mentioned, but its reference can be the reference to the phrase can be inferred from the context. And this is mentioned by Andrew Simpson and colleagues in their analysis of Baer classifier in various East Asian languages for interesting comparative article, and they note that one of the functions of the Baer classifier is bridging anaphora. Right. So what this suggests is that the Baer classifier noun phrase is more like a definite noun phrase with the than it is a demonstrative noun phrase like that. So that brings us to the idea that the classifier is an article or is like an article. And interestingly, Wei Chao said this as well. So rather earlier in describing Cantonese grammar in his Cantonese primer, he said that when a reference is made to something already mentioned, auxiliary noun, that's his term for classifier. So here the noun classifier without, sorry, there should be any prefix demonstrative can be used as in ulewa. So if you know about, we're talking about a fox, then you can say ulewa, the fox said this. And then he adds that for a plurality of things or a mass of something, you will use the auxiliary noun di in the same way, like the. And so by the auxiliary noun di, let me just introduce this morpheme di because I'll come back to it later. In our grammar, we treat the morpheme di as a mensural classifier, denoting a fuzzy quantity of mass or a plural referent, as in disoi, in dimao, right? And by mensural classifier, we basically mean that the meaning is a fuzzy quantity of something. So that applies sort of primarily to mass nouns, but also applies to a mass of animals or a mass of cats, resulting in plural reference, as in dimao, the cats. Okay. So that's the idea of why Arthur would say that the Bayer classifier is similar to a definite noun phrase. Is this a classifier? This has been asked notably by Patricia Paccioni in her studies of this area. The reason we treat it as a classifier is it basically has, to the most part, it has the distribution of a classifier. It comes between a demonstrative and noun. It becomes before a noun in the Bayer classifier construction. Disoi becomes in the possessive classifier construction as leidisoi. It comes with itdisoi, meaning a bit of water, but it doesn't occur with with other numerals. We cannot have sam disoi, 3 waters. Probably because there is a clash between the precise numeration and the fuzzy quantity sense of this morpheme D. So the D either comes with a mass noun as in disoi or with a plurality of count nouns as in dian. It has another puzzling property discovered by Benjamin Aoyang. Ben Aoyang is now a celebrity in Hong Kong's sort of TV and internet celebrity in Hong Kong culture, and he's known as Ben Sir. But before he was Ben Sir, he was a linguist. He's a linguist. He's a linguistic scholar, and one of the things he discovered was that the Bayer noun, Bayer classifier noun phrase with D has a generic reading. So di to yu la yu gui means vegetables are more and more expensive. And it doesn't mean any particular vegetables. It just means vegetable in general. So this is one of a number of ways that maybe D is a classifier, but it's a rather unusual classifier, and we'll see that again later. A formalization of this insight that the classifier is similar to an article is the idea that classifiers are functional heads, and this is used in a number of formal models and developed in detail by Lisa Cheng and Rin Sibisma in Leiden. I apologize to Lisa and Rin for simplifying their theory because I don't want to get into the debate. I don't deal with a linguistic inquiry level of detail of functional heads, I'm afraid. So the general idea is that just as in English, a determiner serves as a functional head of DP, so in Cantonese, a classifier is a functional head of a projection classifier phrase. And in proposing this, they spell out a number of parallel properties, semantic properties of the determiner D in English and or European languages in general, and classifiers in Chinese languages in general, which include encoding definiteness, encoding number, as we just saw with the case of D, and encoding individuation, as we'll see in the case of Miao. So the idea that classifiers have referential functions has been developed by, particularly by Walter Bisang, and he developed it in particular by studying the Miao languages, such as white Hmong and green Hmong. And he gives a typical example of the anaphoric function of the Bayer classifier noun phrase. So there was a tiger chasing it. Then the tiger arrived quickly, and the tiger is expressed as classifier tiger, right? So very much as in Cantonese. And the way he describes this, classifiers are one of the functions, I think this comes from Greenberg, classifiers individuate entities, to distinguish individual entities from the mass of things determined by the Bayer noun. And this involves increasing precision of reference, right? So the classifier individuates the referent and results in indefinite interpretations in at least some contexts. Now, Is it an accident that Hmong looks like Cantonese in this respect? Probably not, right? So at the very least, there was an aerial phenomenon going on here. And it has been proposed, so that, there is a clear parallel between what we saw in Cantonese. I found the cat that I was looking for, the cat that we were talking about, and among where you can say the emperor found the widow that he was looking for, which is expressed by the classifier du. It's the bear classifier noun phrase in Hmong. Right? Interestingly, we also have the possessive classifier construction. Don't tie my table with the classifier in effect marking the possessive construction, and this is also the normal way to mark possession in Hmong, as in my table, my classifier table. So where does this similarity come from? It is widely proposed that the Yue dialects and some other Southern Chinese dialects incorporate a non-Chinese substrate, including influence from Kwadai languages like Zhuang and its ancestors, and Manmiang languages, including Miao and Yao varieties. And Yue Hashimoto proposed that some of the some unique morphemes of Cantonese, such as the quantifier sai, which we generally don't find in Chinese, but you find the zhou sai to do it all. This morpheme Yue Hashimoto attributes to the Miao substrate. I suggested in the 2006 article on Cantonese in its aerial context that this set of properties can most simply be accounted for as by being imported from the Miao or Hmong substrate in the process of language shift. In a modern, if we think about the modern China situation, it may seem a little strange that a minority language like Miao could influence a majority language like Cantonese, but we know from history that the Miao were a majority or a large minority, and that is reflected in the genetic makeup of the Southern Chinese population. So our recent graduate Sito Puyu, in his PhD thesis, cited evidence that the genetic footprint of the Miao people in the Southern Chinese population is very substantial, and that fits with the picture that a large proportion of Southern Chinese population have Hmong ancestry, and therefore we would expect structural influence from the Hmong languages just based on the usual understanding of how language shift works. I said we would revisit this D. So you may have noticed that the morpheme D is sometimes written as D. So this is not the determiner D. This is how Cantonese speakers write D. Why do they write D? Well, because they don't have an etymological character for this morpheme, right? They either write D or they write D, in which with this character that they use to write D in D, so is clearly being used. The mouth radical at the left indicates that it's what called a phonetic borrowing. It's being borrowed for the purpose of representing a homophonous or nearly homophonous morpheme. Pursuing the influence of Hmong, we find in Hmong morphemes which have very similar properties to the Cantonese D. Nathan White, who's just done a PhD, a grammatical description of Hmong, calls this morpheme to the non-singular classifier. And by non-singular, he means very much what we said about the meaning of D. It applies to mass nouns like water and to to plurals like chicken coops, right? It's the cages that you keep chickens in. And there were basically two morphemes in modern Hmong. There was classifier to and the classifier there were two morphemes to and there. And in his description, this one is a non-singular classifier. This one there is sometimes works like a classifier and sometimes work like a quasifier, meaning some, right? And they both apply to plurals and mass nouns, but not to singulars. So the grammar of these morphemes is very, very similar to Cantonese, and even the pronunciation of this one is sufficiently similar, perhaps, to be the source of the Cantonese D. And recall that the Mara languages typically have possessive classifier constructions like the Cantonese one. So this is like our classifier duck cages, and we can have our classifier dongmat, meaning our animals, right? So those are all properties that show a very close match between Hmong and Cantonese, and consistent, I would argue, with the substrate hypothesis. Okay. The second unresolved problem I want to raise is the question of complementizers. So, do we have complementizers in Cantonese, and if so, what are the complementizers? Right? So, there's a number of reasons to believe that we have a complementizer wa, as in he's told me that there was no problem, and this wa exists as a verb. There's reason to believe that this wa is not a verb, since case, what is it? Well, it's proposed that this wa is a complementizer, and so you have a tree structure like this with the complementizer wa selecting a clause or IP if you have an inflection phrase. It's the complement of comp. Okay. But there's another equally or even more popular proposal, which is that a sentence final particle, of which we have many in Cantonese, occupies the comp position in a head final structure like this. So there are many versions of this theory. So we have that for typologists, a very interesting conundrum. There were proposals that this Y is a complementizer, in which case we have a head initial CP, and there are proposals that particles like wa are in the comp position, in which case we will have a head final CP. Can we have our cake and eat it? Can we have it both ways? If so, how? So this is the puzzle, and it seems to be not fully solved. So first of all, why is it proposed that the first morpheme wa is a complementizer? Well, it looks like a verb, but it doesn't behave like a verb, right? So I've glossed it as say because we're not quite sure what it is, but it doesn't really have the properties of the verb say. So if it was a verb, we would expect in some cases to be able to have aspect marking with it, but it seems like it can never take any kind of aspect marking. So we cannot have right? It's completely ungrammatical. Gua is the aspect marker attached, doesn't work at all. Another argument that she gives is that so wa as a verb can take complements like wa beng or teng, using bei as a preposition to say to me, to say to somebody, right? So we should be able to say something like yao gong wa beng or teng mo qin, but we can't. It's completely ungrammatical. So this complement beng or teng, give me here, ge wo tian, in Mandarin, is completely impossible in this construction, again suggesting that this is not the verb wa. Okay. Another argument, as we'll see, is that we can have something like mo yi wei wa, don't think say, right? So we can have this wa basically following a verb in which there's no talking going on at all, right? So in some cases we can have think, say, or don't think, say, right? In which the semantics is incompatible with the verb say, right? So these are all reasons to believe it's not a verb. If it isn't a verb, then maybe it's a complementizer. And if it's a complementizer, then Yangawa and Wushoja both spell out. So Wushoja is talking about the Taiwanese gong, which in this respect is similar to the Cantonese wa, and they both spell out this structure. The verb complement-taking verb, like to talk, selects a CP complement with this wa phrase as its head. Right? Problem. The wa does not seem to form a constituent with the clause that it introduces, right? So, if, for example, if we write dislocate the complement clause, we can dislocate the clause. She said that she was getting married soon. We can say soon getting married. She said that, right? So she said that that will be stranded with the verb instead of dislocated, instead of moving. So focused is the usual analysis for dislocation, instead of being fronted together with the rest of the complement clause. Right? If you try to front the wa with the complement clause that it's supposed to be part of or should be part of, then you get something badly ungrammatic. You get wa zhao li gi fan wa ke tong a gong, right? So the wa fails to move along with the clause that it should be the head of, right? And there were many other constituency tests that I've tried, which all suggest that this obvious solution doesn't work. You know, this structure doesn't seem to apply. There doesn't seem to be any evidence for a CP with this structure. So what is it? Hilary Chappell has done a lot of studies on this problem in Semitic and proposed that wa is a semi-complementizer. And she also notes that the wa doesn't seem to be forming a constituent with the following clause. Instead, it seems to be in constituency with the preceding verb, right? So one piece of evidence she gives for that is that we very often have a pause or a particle like le, which tends to be followed by a pause. Right? We can have she had said to me, you know, she told me the teachers are really bad. So in English, you will have a pause before the that. In Cantonese, you will have a pause and sometimes a particle after the that, after the say, which we've argued to be grammaticalized as a complementizer. Right? So the structure seems to be different. So what is it? Hilary Chappell says the complementizer forms a new complex unit attaching to its preceding speech act or complementary verb. She doesn't say what the unit would be, because she has other concerns and is not proposing a formal structure, but it does create a headache if you are wanting to create a tree structure or decide a hierarchical structure, then it's a puzzle about what this unit would be. One possibility is that this morpheme is cliticized to the preceding verb. Perhaps evidence for that would be the fact that we can add wa to a typical complementizer or conjunction like although. We can have so yin meaning although, and we can also have so yin wa. So although this is the case, in which case we seem to add wa possibly as a clitic to this well-known conjunction so yin. Another approach would be to say, well, maybe it is a complementizer, but it's not this kind of complementizer, which would be a dependent marking complementizer. Maybe it's a head marking complementizer, just as Ansaldo has argued that guo is a head mark comparative marker, as in that guokoi, the guo is meaning than, but it's not in constituency with the object taller than me. It's in constituency with taller than, right? So it's criticized to taller. As Moxie-san and Umberto Ansaldo argue. perhaps as a head marking complementizer. There's a similar construction. So Arthur mentioned I've worked on China Coast Pidgin or Chinese Pidgin English, and in Chinese Pidgin English you find an interesting construction which is "my tinky so" or "I think so," and then the clause follows. So I think so. We have no money, right? And my colleague Michel Lee has proposed that this so is a complementizer in CPE, but again, it's a complementizer in constituency with the verb think, not in the comma tells you there's one indication of that constituency, right? That is in constituency with the verb think and not with the following clause. What Lund Chapter suggests is that, as a semi-complementizer, which does make you wonder what what does it mean to be a semi-complementizer? I'm a little reluctant to adopt semi-complementizer into typology, just as I'm reluctant to adopt semi-Creole into the typology of contact languages. So it has been proposed that, say, Réunionnais, the language of Réunion, is a semi-Creole. What is that really? Do we really want to set up a category of semi-Creole? Most contact linguists have said we don't. And do we want to set up a category of semi-complementizer? The reason to set it up is that in the picture of grammaticalization that Le Chapelle draws or paints across the Semitic complex, you have degrees of grammaticalization, and what you find is that in the southern Min area, so Chaoshanhua or Minanhua in general or Taiwanese, you have highly grammaticalized complementizers, meaning that as often as not, you have the complementizer present in a complementizer clause, in the complement clause, and it has many properties indicating a sort of full grammaticalization or complete loss of the meaning, say, and complete xu in Mandarin, like the complete emptying of the verbal meaning. And if we ask where Cantonese is on this continuum, well, it's somewhere halfway along this continuum, right? So sometimes the verbal meaning of, say, is relevant, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's bleached, but the frequency of this is actually not very high. So going back to the question, do we have complementizers in Cantonese? We can have this in this context, but it isn't very frequent. So if we calculate how many complement clauses contain a complementizer of this kind, the answer will be something under 10%. Right, so it'll be a minority of cases, right? Which is consistent with the idea that we have this structure, but the complementizer is optional, just like it is in English, right? So whenever we can have that in English, we can delete it. Probably, I'm not sure if this is true, but maybe it's a research question about Minanhua. In southern Min, usually you can omit it, but very often it's present. Whereas assuming the structure is correct, then we have to say for the Cantonese it is usually empty, so it is usually left out. Right? So yes, it's partially grammaticalized, but what does that mean in our description of Cantonese grammar? If we were to produce a third edition of our Cantonese grammar, which I probably won't, but great plans to do that. But would we call it a semi-complementizer? And if so, how would we explain that? I'm not sure. And so in that respect, this is an unresolved question. Two more unresolved questions here. Number one, there is an association between this complementizer and irrealis or unreal complement clauses, semantically unreal or hypothetical complement clauses. Right? So if we try to use the word iwe with wa, so tiweng or iwe wa, I thought this was the case, then generally informants don't like it. Occasionally you will catch them saying it, but they don't like it. If you ask them, can we say this? Then they don't like the judgment. They don't like to have wa wa, say, together with a verb of thinking like yue. But if you Google, I Googled this the other day, and I Googled yue wa, and it's quite easy to find examples of yue with wa, that is the verb think, followed by this complementizer say. It's not difficult to find, but the examples you will find tend to be an unreal complement. It tends to be a irrealis complement, like this example. This is from a sort of fan pages about a fan. So you want to, if you're a fan, you want to have a meeting with your idol, then you shouldn't think that you can just make a rendezvous and you'll have a rendezvous, because that's unrealistic thinking. Right? So it's exactly an irrealis complement. So it seems like the irrealis complement then triggers or licenses the presence of the complementizer, or allows it in this case. So that's a puzzle. I think Chapel also notices this, but we're missing an explanation for why this would be the case. Right? Another puzzle is that when we start to investigate this use of say, we will find it with what seem to be non-finite complements, right? So we actually have an example in the second edition of our grammar where we actually have something like sorry, my tones go wrong. A single aristocrat, which means something like eligible bachelor. So he's still thinking of, he's still dreaming of being an eligible bachelor. And the implication is that we will never be. So again, this is an irrealis complement, but it seems to be a non-finite clause. And in fact, also in your Gowais and you have cases with a non-finite complement. What would this tell us? Well, again, I don't have a good answer, except to say that it has been questioned whether we really have a grammatical distinction between finite and non-finite in Chinese, right? And it's been argued both ways. I have found the arguments for a distinction between finite and finite somewhat unconvincing. So this could be proposed as the fact that wa doesn't seem to care whether its complement is finite or not. Is consistent with the proposal that finiteness is not a grammatical distinction in Cantonese. It's consistent with that, it doesn't prove it. Okay. So to summarize my unresolved questions, they include how exactly do definite interpretations of Bayer classifiers arise? There are a number of proposals. I proposed that the abbreviation or the omission of the demonstrative doesn't work because the Bayer classifier phrase is not equivalent to a demonstrative phrase. But exactly how the definite interpretations arise is debated, as we've seen. Also unclear is are these properties somehow inherited from the Mamian substrate? If so, how? It seems to me quite plausible, but are we going to be able to prove that? I think what we need is somebody that that studies Miao languages and studies Semitic languages. We don't have a lot of experts in Miao languages, but that's what we need, somebody to tackle this question. Concerning the complementizer is what I've called non-verbal wa, sort of wa which doesn't have the properties of a verb. Is this a complementizer? If so, what is the structure? I've suggested that it isn't the European CP structure. It isn't the CP structure of English and European languages. It's something else. What the something else is I don't see any good analyses, any good proposals out there at the moment. How come it includes these non-finite complements? Is this ever? I mean, it's consistent with the view that we don't need to make, or we don't have a finiteness distinction in Cantonese. I see one or two people online proposing that these properties mean that it isn't a complementizer after all. Okay, then what is it? Then you have a different problem. Okay, so I hope I've raised enough questions there. So this is a question. My father once said that good research should raise more questions than it answers. So I kind of overdosed on the questions on this occasion rather than the answers. Just want to show you here a very good way to study written Cantonese, or a good way to collect examples of these things, is to buy the literary magazine Resonate. So what this is, it's a journal of written Cantonese texts, short stories, poems, and essays written in Cantonese. So it is a gold mine of Cantonese data. Okay. So thank you for listening. Let me stop and invite discussion, because I promised that would be more interesting than the talk.